We're in 2 Kings chapter 18, if you want to turn there. You know, we began this series a while back. We called it The Life and Times of Elisha. And I was intending to end with some details. It's kind of strange how his life intertwines the book of 2 Kings, and then he sort of drops off the scene for a while. And then we pick up an exciting story about and surrounding his death, his passing in chapter 13. But I was reading the in-between parts, and we just went on the fly. There are too many really interesting and fascinating stories and events that happen in the chapters prior to chapter 13 and the ones following chapter 13. And on a personal level, I've learned some things that I studied years, actually decades ago, about the nation of Israel, their history, the divided kingdom, and what happened to, in particular, the northern kingdom and those tribes. And so the more I read, then it took intense study because there's all of these names that get thrown at us in these chapters. And so I'm not going to cover a verse by verse or even a chapter by chapter study as we go through, but I'm intending by a few weeks from now to finish up in 2 Kings. And we'll look to the end of the chapter because it's very significant historically for the nation of Israel. And you're going to find, even today, that these names get thrust upon us, and there's sometimes some confusion about them for a number of reasons. Number one, sometimes somebody will have just a very little bit of information about them, and their reign will be contained in a few verses. Sometimes there'll be chapters about that person's life and what happened in the course of their lifetimes. Kind of reminds us of our lives. Some of you live more exciting lives than me, and maybe your ancestors will want to be telling exciting stories about what happened in your life, and some people's lives are rather normal and uneventful. And then we have two different lines of kings from the two different empires, and to make it even more confusing, they'll throw in some kings of some nations around Israel that factor prominently in the narrative, the biblical narrative, such as the case with Ben-Hadad, who we looked at last week. We really didn't finish everything that would happen in his life, but we'll look at some of those things to conclude his life. And so I'm going to help us all. I ran off a number of different resources, and I kept the one I thought was best, and I'll be giving that to you today. It simply gives a list of the kings of Israel in the north and the kings of Judah in the south. And on this chart I'll be giving you, it has the names of the kings. It also has the years of their reign. It'll be really helpful. It has the biblical references to show where you can read about those reigns or about their lives. Some of them are very brief. Some of them cover chapters. It also has, on this one chart, circumstances about their predecessor, how they were related to their predecessor. Sometimes they were the sons. In a rare case, we may look at it today, there's even a mother of a deceased king who takes the throne and reigns for a period of 7 or 8 years. And then to add to the mix, we have some kings who are given different names in different places of the Bible. King Jehoash, for instance, is also called King Joash. And if we didn't know that, as I didn't, you might get confused. And just to add a little bit more of a twist to this, sometimes the king in the northern kingdom has the same name as the king in the southern kingdom. So if this chart will be of great help to you, as it was to me, to get it all figured out and to put it all in perspective. And of course, at the end of this Bible study in Sunday school in 3 or 4 weeks or so, we'll be collecting all of your charts from you, and we'll be giving you a test where you have to name all the kings in order and the years of their reign, the prophets that were in office at that time and how they died and how they were related to their predecessors. You have to memorize all of that. So I would suggest you get on that and memorize everything on this chart. So we have to take a quiz. All right, you ready? You're going to be ready for that? I said, Pastor Miller, please don't do that. I would fail it myself. So it's very complicated. We're going to clear it all up for you today. But we're going to start in 2 Kings chapter 8. I'm just going to read one verse here and say a few things. We're going to go back to 1 Kings because I found a fascinating correlation between something that happened way back in Elijah's day. We're looking at the life and times of Elisha, but Elijah was his predecessor. And it is nothing short of amazing that God made a prophecy about what would happen with specific people in specific political and religious realms that were fulfilled in the life of Elisha. And we're going to look at that passage briefly and then catch up with this if we can. But I want to begin by looking at 2 Kings chapter 8, and I'm going to read verse 16 and make a comment, because that's where we left off last week. In the 5th year of Joram, who is also called Jehoram, of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, Jehoshaphat, being then king of Judah, Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, began to reign. So you're getting an idea. Just that one verse alone, you're reading that and saying, what in the world? Who are all these people and all these names, and how can they reign at the same time? Again, one thing that may help us is very often, certainly the people that produce charts like this had the benefit of dating the reign of these kings, because the Bible writers often put the name of the king in the opposing kingdom as they listed the beginning of the reign. For instance, King Joel reigned at this time, and while he was reigning, there was another king in the other kingdom who was reigning, and they'll put both of them simultaneously in a Bible verse to get a sense of context. But remember, there are two separate kingdoms. The one to the north was called what? Israel. The one to the south was called Judah. If you remember that alone, it'll help you get some of the confusion out of it. They'll often list a new king that comes in. Maybe someone is killed or dies or is sick or he dies in battle. We have all of these scenarios taking place. When it mentions the one who succeeded them in the south, the Bible will often say, oh, and by the way, the king that was reigning in the northern kingdom at that time was named this. And so it helps to put all of that in perspective. So then again, it's a little tricky when they're the names for the northern and southern kingdom. Let me give you this chart. Maybe, could you guys help me out and pass this out to everybody? I want to put this in your hands. And I'm going to give an example of that when you get this chart. By the way, the 10 tribes of Israel, before we get through this study, we'll see how these 10 tribes are assimilated into the Babylonian culture. That's how the phrase the 10 missing tribes of Israel, like they somehow just went for a walk and never came back. No, what happened to them is not that they were all killed or that they just mysteriously disappeared and God just raptured them all out of the face of the planet. What happened was they were overthrown by the Babylonians, and over a period of time, the mixture of their people with the other nations of the world caused them to lose their cultural identity. They were no longer Israel. They were a mixture. They married with the other nations. And the southern tribes kept their identity much longer, but were not without their own problems as well. But we're going to look at, before we get done with 2 Kings, we're going to look at how that happened. It's a tremendous historical note to try to decide what happened to these supposed 10 lost tribes of Israel. They weren't so much lost as they were assimilated into the pagan nations around them, and that's what happened to them. But if you take note, like it says under the kings of Israel, there's 7 or 8 of them listed. There's sort of a little bit of a gap, and you'll notice the next name on that list is Jehoram on the upper section of Israel, Jehoram, and there's an asterisk by his name. If you look down at the very bottom of that chart, the asterisk is telling you that Jehoram is also referred to as Joram. And it is my suspicion that the writer of the 1st and 2nd Kings made that distinction so that he would not be confused with the king of the southern kingdom that carried the same name. Because if you look down, there's also that little gap here under the kings of Judah under the south. After the first 4 names, you see that? There's a king named Jehoram listed there. Now, there's significant differences. You'll find that they came into office under different circumstances. The years of their reign were a little different, but they were reigning simultaneously. And so I believe, as do some Bible scholars believe, that the writer of 2 Kings adjusted or adapted the name of the northern kingdom king by the name of Jehoram, they called him Joram so as not to confuse him with the southern king. If you notice the years of his reign, 852 to 841, if you look at Jehoram at the bottom, 853 to 841, they were reigning simultaneously. There's also another reason for that goes back to heredity, but I won't discuss that just yet. So doesn't this chart remove all our confusion? Well, not really, but it takes some of it away. And if you just take that chart and leave it in your Bible there, in that spot for the next few weeks as we finish up the book of 2 Kings, it might help you to refer to it, to get an idea of the different kingdoms, each with its own rich history. Each of the kingdoms separately but simultaneously writing their own history, and they have a very different history. You may want to take note in the center column of there, it says character. It says character. What is the character of these kings that came to reign? Well, if you look at the northern kingdom of Israel, it's pretty consistent. They're all what? They're all bad. And by the way, some are worse than others, but they're all kind of bad. Now, if you look at the kings of Judah at the bottom, there were several that were good. And by the way, you can't summarize a person's entire life with just the designation of whether good or bad. Some were really good. Two of the kings from the southern kingdom that strike me as being wonderful kings are Josiah, remember that name, and also Hezekiah. Was not without his faults, but they were very good leaders for their nations. And there are some kings in the northern kingdom that were bad, and some were really, really bad. Ahab was really, really bad, as were his two sons after him. In fact, one of them reigned, and you may notice in the northern kingdom, Ahab, he was wounded in battle. That's how he died. Ahaziah, he was so bad that God allowed him to fall through lattice in his house. He sustained injuries that ultimately ended his life. And Jehoram is the brother of Ahaziah, and he was murdered by Jehu. We'll try to get to that story today if we can. So having said that, I want you to keep maybe your sheet, your map in this section, and I want to go back and show you something from a previous chapter that's kind of important, because God was going to use Elisha to assist and proclaim his judgment upon both the northern and southern tribes in various stages of their history. And in today's lesson, he's going to use a man by the name of Jehu to complete a lot of that. But I want you to look back at 1 Kings chapter 19. Now, this goes back again to the days of Elijah, not Elisha, but Elijah. It's written in such a matter-of-fact way with such detail, you might confuse this passage and think that Elijah had full knowledge of these events and people that were to take place in the future. Elijah didn't even know some of the people he prophesied about. He was not even aware of them. These are events several years into the future. But if you look back at 1 Kings chapter 19, look at this prophecy that Elijah states in verse number 15. It says, "And the Lord said unto him, Go and return on the way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And Jehu the son of Nimrod shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room." So God gives three different people, three distinct roles from people, some of whom Elijah had never met before and would never meet in the course of his lifetime. Wonderful perspective given to us about prophecy. When God gave a directive and God prophetically allowed a prophet to tell what was going to happen in the future, it didn't most of the time or sometimes or usually or almost always, it every single time came to fruition just as he said. And this is exactly what happened here. And we see the fulfillment of those things in the passage we're now in 2 Kings chapter 8 and the chapters following. Specifically, we find that Hazael's murder of Ben-Hadad. We looked at that last week. And I'll just give you a summary of that in a moment if you didn't get that lesson last week, where the king of the nation of Syria was a guy named Ben-Hadad. Ben-Hadad actually had some history with Elisha earlier. He besieged Samaria, and remember those events where the lepers were so desperate, people were engaged in cannibalism, and they went out? Well, what happened was God sent the noise of an army coming to assist during the night, and Ben-Hadad's armies panicked and they left everything in the middle of the night. It reminded me, Brother Randy, of the story in World War II when the Allied forces were going to invade Europe in Normandy, and they wanted to. They didn't want it to be too predictable because it was hard enough for the American troops and the Allied forces who landed on the beach to make it, in inroads into the area to attack the enemy. So they developed a ruse. I don't know if this has ever been done in history before or since, but I know some of the things they did was they inflated tanks. They put air in these big tanks to make them look like real tanks, and they were amassing all of our artillery and troops on the ground, and they brought tanks and blew them up with air and left them there, and from an aerial view or from a distance they looked like all these tanks were amassing, and they deceived the Axis troops into thinking that we were going to be landing at a different location. They also, interestingly, back before the days of satellites and all the other technology we have today, they also pumped in loudspeakers of artillery, movement of artillery, like they were amassing all of these troops and so forth, and the Germans assumed this would be the location of the invasion. And they deceived them into thinking that it was going to happen at a whole different location than it actually ended up happening. Something similar is kind of going on in this particular passage of Scripture as we look at what was happening here. God is miraculously producing noises that cause the Syrians to come to the conclusion that they hired the Hittites or the Egyptians, which is not an uncommon practice in that day. Pay them a great exorbitant amount of money. You come fight for us and bring your army and help us, and we'll pay you all of these treasures. And Ben-Hadad's armies were convinced that's what was happening, so they took off during the night. And during that process, Ben-Hadad already had some contact with Elisha and knew about him and despised him. He felt like he was privy to everything he was saying, all of his plans and military. They were convinced there was someone in their camp giving the Israelites all of the information about their location, their whereabouts, and when they were going to attack. And finally someone said, no, it's Elisha. He hears from God. He knows from God. And so remember that Ben-Hadad was going to kill Elisha, circled the city, and God struck them with blindness. All of those events happened. So this same king, Ben-Hadad, is now suffering from a sickness, a life-threatening sickness. And what does he do in that situation? He wants to know whether he's going to live or die. So he sends an entourage to find what he called the man of God. And he said, I want you to go to him and ask him, am I going to survive or not? It's all in the earlier verses of chapter 8. I was thinking about that. People may live their whole lives flaunting their nose at God, defying God's word, denying the blood atonement of Jesus Christ. They may live selfishly and wickedly. They may live all they do is hurt themselves and others in the course of their whole lifetimes. But something often happens at the end of a man's life when he is staring death in the face, no matter how hard his heart may be. Oftentimes, in the recesses of his heart, he's saying to himself, what's going to happen when I die? It's a good time for evaluation. What's going to happen when I die? I will almost never turn down an opportunity to speak at anybody's memorial service. In fact, Pastor Rocky and I have both done several memorial services for people for whom we did not know anything about. We had no contact with them, and sometimes no or little contact with their family members. Didn't know them at all. But if they call the church or contact the church and say, is there someone that can conduct a memorial service for somebody? I feel under an obligation before God to take those opportunities, and I don't think I've ever turned one down, actually. Recently, there was a set of circumstances that took place, and there was a graveside service up near Jim and Wendy Mason's way of town, way up north somewhere in the foothills. and I drove up there. I think it was Coarsegold or Oakhurst, one of the two. I drove there. I remember the day, it was pouring rain. I was out there in the pouring rain. It was a miserable day. It was cold and windy. And I was out there doing a memorial service for someone I'd never met, knew nothing about. But I felt like those settings provide us opportunities to preach the gospel in a way that even is different from a church service like this. People come to church, they expect to hear the Bible. But when they go to a memorial service, they don't know what they're going to get. And so I took the first few moments, I introduced myself, and I admitted to them I'd never met the deceased person. Didn't know anything about him. And that I never met anybody there that day. I spoke to the family members on the phone, never met a single one of them. But I said, I believe that God has us all here for a purpose, and I opened up the Bible and I gave people the gospel very clearly and concisely. Because when someone loses a loved one or is facing a potential situation like that themselves, they'll often think about the afterlife. I have had, on a few wonderful rare occasions, including with my own natural father, by the way, I've had the opportunity to go to a bedside of someone who was dying, and I've had the opportunity to present the gospel in such a way that they were more receptive than at any other time in their lives, and they've trusted Jesus Christ as their Savior, literally on their death's bed. And I share that with you because you will undoubtedly have opportunities with people who are facing life-altering circumstances in their life, and they may have rebuked your attempts to witness to them dozens of times before that. Don't disguise the fact that death is a very sobering, convicting time of life, and people will often listen to that. And Ben-Hadad, wanting to get as much of an advantage as he could, he sent somebody there to find out whether he was going to live or die, and they didn't go empty-handed. He sent the treasures. Well, he sent 40 camels stocked with goods to give to the man of God. The one he wanted to kill before, that he sent an army to kill, surround the city and kill, the one he despised, now he's asking for help. Am I going to live or die? You remember the story. Hazael, who was more than just a servant, Hazael was a trusted advisor. Hazael was not related to King Ben-Hadad. In fact, Hazael was like a servant. But Hazael was the one to carry this message. Ben-Hadad wants to know if I'm going to live or die. And as he asked the question, God was revealing to Elisha what was going to happen. In his mind, he realized what was going to happen. And things got really awkward there. Really awkward, because he looked upon Hazael, Elisha did, and as he looked upon him, he didn't say anything. You know, remember those awkward moments you get before someone and they're looking at you and they're not saying anything or doing anything, and you're like, okay, it's getting kind of awkward here, He's staring at me, and then he begins to cry, to weep. Now, he may have been weeping for Hazael himself, who he knew would, according to chapter 19 of 1 Kings, who would betray his king, and he might have been burdened about him. He might have been burdened for Ben-Hadad. For as much of an adversary as he was, this man was going to die. That's exactly what Elisha said. He said, I think it's verse 10. Is it verse 10? Let me look down here real quick. Yeah. Thou mayest certainly recover, howbeit the Lord has shown me that he shall surely die. It's kind of a weird cryptic message. Yeah, he could recover from this, but God showed me that he's not going to. He's going to die. And he could have been weeping for Ben-Hadad, knowing that he was days, maybe hours away from his death. But the Bible goes on to clarify where these tears came from in Elisha's mind. They came for his own people. He had a burden for his people. Specifically, the Bible tells us that he would, speaking of Hazael, would set their strongholds on fire. In other words, Hazael would be this servant who came to deliver this message would go and set the nation of Israel, their city, their walled cities on fire. He would, according to the Bible, slay their young men with the sword. He would dash their children. A word I looked up that meant to strike violently against something. He would dash their children to death, and he would rip up their women with child. Now, all these things were revealed to Elisha, and that produced this emotional reaction to that. He knew that King Ben-Hadad would die, and it would put Hazael in a position of leadership. Elijah prophesied about it way back tens of years earlier, and now it's going to come to pass. It was not a good place for the nation of Israel at that time. So we see the brutal murder in verse number 15. We covered that last week, where he covered his face with a wet cloth and strangled him, and then took the leadership position. How sad it is. We see a lot of this treachery in the book of 2 Kings, where sometimes a person's trusted advisors are their worst enemies. And sometimes kings are killed by their own family members. And in this list that I gave you, one of the kings was actually a queen. One of the kings, you see on the kings of Judah, on the 6th, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1 down, it says mother. All the rest say sons, uncles, grandsons reigned instead. This is the one king of the northern and southern kingdoms who was actually a queen. And that lady right there mentioned, Athaliah, was a very brutal, wicked woman. In fact, she and Jezebel probably could have been good friends. They kind of cut from the same mold. And she tried to kill all of the household of the reigning king off by killing them all. But for the intervention of God, she would have been successful. So we see Hazael switching sides. He probably was accepted into this position of leadership, rose in the ranks. Ben-Hadad saw something in Hazael that would convince him that he would be a good guy, a good advisor, a right-hand man. The one person in the nation he could count on would be Hazael. I believe in the early stages of his position helping King Ben-Hadad in Syria, that he was probably a great helper to the king. He was a trusted advisor. He was probably a close friend. Who knows how close? He may have loved him like an own son, but to show the wickedness of man's heart, Hazael, who was told years earlier by Elijah that he would be king, finally carried out I think he waited long enough, and he felt like now was the time to finish off the king, and he assumed the role of leadership. And so we're going to see how God will judge them. So that's switching sides. Hazael was once a loyal follower, and then he became a betrayer and an assassinator. I want you to see, secondly, the judgment from Judah. Because now the scene changes from Syria, Ben-Hadad's camp, to the capital city of the southern kingdom. And here's where it might be helpful also to look at that chart and refer to the chart and see what's going on exactly between the different kings. When a king is referenced in the northern or southern kingdom, very often their counterpart is given to us as well. That's what happens here. You'll notice all the bad character of the northern kings. And then there was a man called Joram, who is rendered Jehoram on this chart in this passage, and we find out that he was bad. Now I'm going to tell you one reason why Jehoram was bad. I'm referring now to the king of the southern kingdom, Jehoram. Jehoram was bad partly because, and I say this for the benefit of the young men and young ladies in our congregation here this morning, partly because he didn't marry wisely. How do you know that, Pastor Miller? Well, look at verse number 18 of chapter number 8. Well, let me go back to verse 16. In the 5th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, Jehoshaphat being the king of Judah, Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, began to reign. 32 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem, and he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. He was the king of the southern kingdom, but he lived just like the kings to the north, who were all what? Bad eggs. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, as did the house of Ahab, for the daughter of Ahab was his wife. And he did the evil in the sight of the Lord. So we know Ahab was definitely a big bad egg. His 2 sons were bad eggs. One of them God killed. One of them died from treachery. And now there's a daughter mentioned. And for some reason, this king of the southern kingdom married the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. So, I state my case. He didn't marry wisely. and that became a problem to him. He began to follow the ways of the northern kingdom. In chapter 9, Elisha instructs one of his students to go to the. So we're going to flip over to chapter 9 to go to this house and anoint Jehu to be the next king of the nation. And you'll notice midway down in the kings of Israel, Jehu follows Jehoram, also called Joram, who was the son of Ahab. God instructs a man of God from the school of the prophets to go there and tell Jehu and anoint him to be the next king of Israel. Well, you can imagine in this climate, that would not be well received. I mean, there were kings that were killed for far less than that. And Ahab's sons in particular were bad eggs. So it would not fare well for Jehu if somebody said, hey, we heard there was a great event. The man of God from the school of the prophets came and told Jehu that he was going to be the next king, while the previous king is still living and on the throne. Not only was it unhealthy for Jehu, it was also unhealthy for the man of God, this unnamed student in the school of the prophets. It was also unhealthy for him to go deliver that message. So much so that Elisha said, when you go to do this, go in there, take care of business, anoint him king, and then get out the back door and don't stop running. You know, that's not a very comfortable place for preachers to find themselves, you know, where they're little. It's like somebody sending their dogs after us, you know, like, you know, you're running for your life, you know. He had to go in there, anoint him with the oil and say, you're going to be the next king. Good luck. See you later. I've got to go. And he books it out the back door and he's running away, and he was anointed king at that particular spot. And so you'll find those details in the earlier verses of 2 Kings chapter 9. And the problem is that, you know, King Jehoram was still on the throne. Ahab's son was still on the throne. And so this is obviously a difficult job to do, but Jehu would factor greatly in the biblical narrative. Remember I said that some kings, their reign is just summarized in a few verses, and they're there, and even if they reign for a lot of years, it could be a very brief time. Jehu, by the way, if you look at your chart, reigned for 28 years. The only person who reigned more in the northern kingdom was Jeroboam II, which we'll look at later. But he had the second longest reign of all the kings of Israel in the northern tribe. He reigned for a long time. But he was anointed while the previous king, Ahab's son, was still on the throne. So, you know, it's kind of an interesting situation here. Now, as you look at these kings, in fact, the northern kingdom in particular, they're all bad. They're all bad eggs. A question that may surface in your mind, should surface in all of our minds, is this. Why would God allow these wicked kings to gain the throne and remain on the throne, sometimes for decades or for years? I'm not going to be, you know, too straightforward and symbolic to say that we often look at people in our own government and wonder, how in the world did God allow that person to be in office for, you know, whoever that might be, for however long they were in there. I generally had a great respect. When I grew up in school, our presidents' pictures were on a chart in our elementary classroom, and we honored and revered our presidents, our former presidents. We had days dedicated. Back then, it wasn't President's Day. They had separate holidays for both Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. We had separate holidays in our school. We're given a day off school. So now they combine them and call it President's Day. But I remember the chart and the teachers talking about some of our presidents, and that was then. This is now. And sometimes you wonder what, not just at the highest level, but at other government levels, we're wondering, why would God allow that person to take office and gain a position of leadership? Not only that, why would God allow them to stay in that position for so long sometimes? And we sometimes struggle with that. I can assure you that God knows exactly what he's doing. God knows exactly what he's doing. And he does allow people who do not have any regard for himself or his word or his son or you. God has willingly allowed people like that to come to a position of leadership in countries like ours always for a purpose. And many times that purpose is to judge or to try to draw his people back to himself. So I'm not one of those people who go around bemoaning the elections. And in fact, I probably don't surround myself with enough political ads. I just don't get into that, whether I like the candidate or not. I don't like mud throwing. I don't like to see I don't like to see any candidate for any level of office to get in office by throwing mud at the other candidate, the opposing candidate. You may like that. You may say, Pastor, that gets me all riled up. I love that. Good for you. Watch all the political ads you can and do all that research on the internet if you. I don't get into that. It bothers me. It troubles me. I remember I had elementary class. We looked up to our presidents and leaders, but God knows exactly what He's doing. Remember this: God has a timing for everything He does, and God will accomplish His purposes, even in significant areas like the leaders of our nation. And this, my dear friends, is a clear example of that. Every one of the kings of the northern kingdom were bad in the minds of this person, and that's what the Bible used the word evil, which is a harsher word than just bad. They were evil. And some of the references say they exceeded the evil actions of their predecessors, or carried on, or did more evil than the one before them. These are a lot of, but I want to remind you, especially in an election year, we cannot put our confidence in man. And even when things happen that may trouble you or bother you, we need to recognize that there's a divine hand steering all of the events of our country and all the terrible things that may be happening, and laws that are changing sometimes at breakneck speed regarding the Christian liberties that we are losing, or the spiritual climate of our community. God knows everything that's going on, and He is going. If there's one clear-cut thing that comes out in the study of these kings, is He is going to accomplish His purposes. And sometimes He uses wicked men to accomplish those purposes. So I meant to get a little farther in this, but we'll pick it up next week. But we're going to find out, after years of seemingly getting away with her wicked deeds, Jezebel. Remember that name? I've been on this planet 60. How old am I, honey? 60, 64, 65. I'm getting older by the minute. 65. Right, 66, 65. I've never once in my lifetime ever heard of anybody naming their child Jezebel. There's a reason for that. And we're going to see her demise, her eventual demise, next Sunday in Sunday school. And we should not rejoice over these terrible things that happen to people, but we should look at that passage very soberly and recognize her demise was a shameful, disgraceful, sad ending to a person's life. And I wouldn't wish that upon my enemy. And we'll see how that happened next week.